right, everyone. So in this video, I'm going to be going through chapter 3, which is focusing on genes, evolution, and environment. And before you're confused and wondering what's going on, yes, I do know how to count. I purposely skipped over 3.3. So I'm hoping at this point you've already gone into Revel and done your reading for Module 3, and maybe at that moment you also realized that I skipped over 3.3. So I made the decision for a few different reasons. The first reason is I think that section of your textbook is very problematic. It's based on outdated science, and it kind of reduces it, in my mind, in a problematic way. And so the main reason I'm skipping over it is just because, again, I think that some of that content is problematic. But it's really related to the second reason that I decided to delete it from this module, because this is a short week for us, and I felt like to really include it in a way I felt comfortable with, I was going to have to spend more time on it, which isn't really conducive for a short week. So feel free to read that section if you would like it. Again, the main reason I'm skipping over it is I think it is too simplistic in terms of helping us understand sexuality and differences in people. And I think that it actually in some ways perpetuates some of the stigma and stereotypes that certain groups in our society face. So if you have questions about that, I'm happy to discuss it further with you. But just for the purposes of class, we're going to skip over section 3.3. So to get started, what I want you to do is write down 10 things that describe you as a person. Those 10 things could be physical traits or characteristics, personalities, abilities, special talents, maybe things you're bad at, any 10 things. There's no right or wrong, and this is just a list that only you will see. Once you've written down those 10 things, what I want you to do is write down where you think those 10 things came from. So for example, did you think you inherited it from a family member, or do you think this is something that was more kind of fostered through your environment as a child? So go ahead and pause your video. Just scribble this down. You're not turning it in. It's not a graded assignment. It's just to get you thinking about who we are and where these aspects of ourselves come from. Okay, and once you're ready, go ahead and hit play again. Okay, so hopefully you've written down 10 things, thought about where they came from. I obviously cannot see your list because I'm not there, but what I want you to do is just kind of pause and think, what was that process like? What types of things did you focus on? Did you focus on physical traits? Did you focus on personality traits? And then looking at your explanations for these things, did you mostly identify genetic or heritable explanations, or did you focus more on kind of childhood experiences or environmental? And so what I'm going to guess is each of you came up with a really unique list. But I'm wondering if when you identified where these things came from, did you focus on only one cause? Or did any of you potentially write down that it's both heritable and also potentially, is related to your childhood experiences? Because, not to ruin the point of this whole lecture, what we know about who we are and our traits and our preferences and our skills is that it's really hard to identify one cause, that it really is this combination of genetics and environment. So keep your list close to you and kind of keep revisiting it and thinking about it as we go through kind of the evolution of how the field has thought about genetics and environment, and then also consider some of the ways that maybe it impacts how you view yourself. So what I kind of just alluded to is this kind of historical debate that used to exist in the field. So it used to be nature versus nurture, and maybe you've heard of that debate before. And so the nature side would always emphasize genes and say that we're basically born with what we've got, that our heritability and the genetics of our genetics basically are the main determining factors of who we become and who we are now. Whereas the nurture side of the debate would say it really is about learning and experiences, and that we're born as a blank slate, and then as we encounter different things and get feedback from different people and different experiences, that's going to lead to our development of who we become. And so just a few decades ago, this used to be a pretty hot debate. This was legitimately a question in the field. Is it more nature or more nurture? And obviously what I hope you're picking up on, based on the word historical up here, this is not a debate anymore. The field has definitively concluded that it is in fact both. So not to ruin it, there is no winner here. So it's no longer nature versus nurture. Really what we use now is a phrase called nature via nurture. And so it recognizes the combination, the two influences, the interaction between the two. That's really what we need to be focusing on in our research. And so you'll notice that in the lecture, I'm going to skip over some things. Your textbook does a great job of talking about genes and chromosomes and DNA. Please make sure you've reviewed that and that you understand that information. I just thought your book did a great job, and so I didn't want to bore you by reviewing that, in great detail. So I am purposely skipping over that in the lecture, but do want to pause and say that that is still important. So again, today we know that heredity and environment are constantly interacting. This might seem a little bit weird, but genes actually affect the kind of experiences we have. I don't know about you, but when I learned about genes and heredity, I guess it would have been maybe in elementary school, I was basically taught that genes are just this blueprint that we're born with and that there's no deviation. And in actuality, that's not the case at all. That there is a lot of communication and interaction between our genes and our experiences. So, for example, a child that has a genetic predisposition to being athletic is probably going to have more experiences related to that, or experiences that foster that, I should say. So, for example, they're probably going to be more likely to get a soccer ball for birthdays. They might be encouraged to attend a sports camp rather than a science camp. And so that genetic predisposition is then going to feed into and foster their environmental experiences as well. But what's really cool is that the relationship can also go the other direction, that our experiences can affect our genes. And again, I think this is the part of the interaction that students are more surprised by, because it does kind of run counter to what we're taught in like elementary school, but that our experiences can actually affect our genes. So for example, stress, that's probably the biggest experience that's studied in this area of the field, can influence our genes. It can influence how our genes are expressed. It can influence how our genes are turned on and off over time. And so experience is, for many things that we're going to talk about today, just as important as our genes, because in fact it impacts our genes. And so if, your mind is already blown, or you're finding yourself maybe a little bit uncomfortable with some of this information, it's not surprising, because we are constantly facing these kind of conflicting messages. The popular press is always excited to talk about what studies find in terms of causes for autism and schizophrenia and extroversion and intelligence, and this is popular information. And so you probably have been exposed to lots of information about environment and genes, or the nature versus nurture debate. And in some ways, the popular press still acts as if this is a debate. And I think that these two articles that are not that old, the bottom one was published in 2014 and the top one was published in 2015. That's not that long ago. They are still acting as if there is this debate, right? It's one or the other. So here in 2014, Fox News published an article that said environment as influential as genes in autism, study says. And then this more recent one says genes almost wholly responsible for autism, study finds. So, there is no question here. This is saying that genes are the most influential aspect of the development of autism. And so it's not surprising that people don't truly have an appreciation for how these different mechanisms can come together to influence our development. And so epigenetics is kind of the buzzword. This to me is kind of the meat and potatoes of this module. And it really is kind of to me, the future of the field. So if this is an area that's all, at all interesting to you, or maybe kind of is hitting on some of your career interests, there is a ton of work that needs to be done. And so I think this is a really promising area of the field of psychology. And so this kind of, I think, hits on what I was talking about a few minutes ago, that our genome is not a static blueprint. And I think, again, that runs really counter to a lot of the messages people are exposed to. In actuality, often there's mutations that occur. So a mutation may create a variant form of a gene. And some of that might be kind of a prenatal experience that, it's kind of an inherited mutation. Others, it actually happens after birth. So there may be a mistake that occurs during cell division, or maybe someone's exposed to ultraviolet radiation, which can lead to cancer. And so mutations are fairly common, and that can actually create variations in genes. But we also know that there's a ton of differences in the activity at the kind of genetic level for people. So it's not just the differences in the genes themselves. And so, again, I can't speak, for your educational experiences, but I know, when I first learned about genes, not only was it a static blueprint, but my blueprint is different from your blueprint, which is different from everybody else's blueprint, unless you have an identical twin. And so, in actuality, it isn't just differences in the genes themselves. I think that's just an overly, simplistic way of talking about this. Really, what we need to be focusing in on is that people differ because of differences in their gene expression, or another way of saying that is in the activity. And so epigenetics is the study of gene expression, which is essentially looking at maybe differences we see in people or changes that might occur because of expression of genes rather than changes in the DNA-based sequence itself. So just to give you a few examples, and I know your textbook gave a few, but I think it's important, especially when it's something kind of complex like this, it's important to give a few different examples. So the first example is that eating certain foods can impact gene expression. And so there's been a ton of research looking at the impact of diet on some of these more complex psychological traits and abilities. So things like cognitive functioning, things like physical health, like your risk for cancer. And there's some pretty strong research coming out showing that eating a particular diet can actually impact gene expression, which then in turn impacts these other, again, fairly complex presentations. We also know that maternal stress, I a few minutes ago said stress is a main thing that epigenetics is studying. And so, for example, stress can lead to the release of a hormone, and then that hormone can lead to changes in the DNA in the brain of the fetus, which then in turn impacts long-term genetic expression. So this is an experience a person has prenatally. They're in the fetus, mom is experiencing stress, that then has impacts on their own hormones or their own brain development, which then can have such long-term impact that even like late in life, we can look at the influence on their anxiety and their depression. And so this is just so much more complex than the field thought it was even 10 years ago, right? 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we were looking for, the influence of individual genes on things like anxiety, depression, cancer risk. And in actuality, it isn't even, that it's more than one gene, it's that we need to also consider environmental influences. And so, there's lots of subfields, there's lots of different ways of talking about similarities between people and differences between people. And one of the main subfields of psychology that is important to kind of highlight right now in this part of the course is evolutionary psychology. And so with evolution, we're just talking about how common different gene frequencies are within a population. And so it's important to look across generation because what we see is that we might see changes in how common particular genes are within a population. And so these changes can occur lots of different ways. As I said before, mutations can happen during like cell division, or, in the copying of DNA sequence, and then natural selection, which I know you all learn about again, probably in like elementary school, with this idea that, particular traits, abilities, preferences might be more favorable, given current situations or circumstances, and then they would be more likely to be sustained in future generations through procreation. And so when we start to look at, why particular species have similarities across them, it is important to talk about the kind of evolutionary perspective that would lead to those gene frequencies, occurring at different rates. And so I think that when we first learn about natural selection, again, probably in elementary school, we're kind of led to believe that, natural selection takes, forever, many generations. But, in actuality, there's been some research showing that natural selection has occurred over just a course of a few generations when particular groups of people have had to respond to, unusual or extreme circumstances. And so what I want you to do is I want you to think about if the pandemic were to last for several generations. I mean, that will not happen. Do not panic. I think we're close to a vaccine. But just think about for a second, if it were to last several generations, what changes would we expect to see? Essentially, what are the challenges we're currently facing, and what traits or preferences would be favorable to give particular people an advantage for survival, essentially. So think about that for a few minutes, and then when you're ready, go ahead on to part 2 of the video.